The private school tax, the VAT on private schools, comes into effect tomorrow. And this is just one of a number of taxes that have been developed by Rachel Reeves. And papers like the Telegraph suggest these are taxes constructed out of envy rather than pragmatic reform. And my concern is that even if these taxes are a good idea, they should have been phased in rather than uh, thrown in so fast with sort of knee jerk. They should have been eased into the system rather than jerked into the system. And that force with which these are enacted, I think, will be counterproductive in terms of the money that it can actually produce. Either the VAT on schools, which allows parents no time to make other arrangements, and it's a punishment for the children who are already in those systems which are collapsing. Uh, and it's not enough to turn around and say, "Oh well, it's only one or two schools which are closing. It's one or two schools now. It will be one or two schools at the end of the coming term, and one or two schools at the end of the summer term." But even if one person is hurt by these taxes, they are bad. Taxes are there to generate money and to do good, not to do harm, not to pursue some sort of ideological nastiness. They are constructive rather than destructive. And central to Reeves' fiscal reforms is the imposition of this 20% VAT on private school fees from January. And the government argues that this will inject £1.7 billion annually into state education by 2030, funding 6,500 new teachers, boosting SEND provisions, and other implementations. In fact, so much that actually none of it is really achievable, particularly if a lot of students leave the private schools and then have to be accommodated in the state schools. Reeves champions this as a moral imperative, asserting that tax breaks for private schools are, quote, a luxury we cannot afford. Well, that may well be true, but as I say, the knee-jerk approach is not the way forward. Yet critics highlight a paradox, a potential paradox. Smaller independent schools, already strained, may close, pushing students into the state schools, and that is the problem, and that is the bit which was not foreseen. The Treasury insisted that wasn't going to happen, that faith schools particularly would not close, but one faith school already has. Emmanuel College, Emmanuel Prep School in North London. And this domino effect of the smaller schools, which isn't at all about pandering to the elite, it's catering to niche needs, religious education, or indeed to the education of children with special needs that may not be fully documented because it takes a long time to document SEND. And there are many private schools that are well equipped to deal with the pressing needs that parents know their children face. And if they have enough money to afford the private education, then it seems reasonable that they should take that. And in some cases, these schools offer bursaries and scholarships for those children. To overwhelm a state system already grappling with teacher shortages and strained resources, ironically erodes the very equality that Reeves claims to champion. The middle classes, particularly those people who are struggling to make ends meet anyway, face a perfect storm. Threshold freezes on income tax continue to drag more earners into higher bands. A stealth tax projected to raise billions. Stamp duty on second homes increases by 5,975 for a typical family, discouraging investment in property. Council tax hikes alongside rising employer national insurance further strain household budgets. And a middle class family with one child in a private school will see an additional £8,000 in taxes next year, encompassing school fees, income tax thresholds, and ancillary costs. The Independent Schools Council warns that VAT on private schools may well backfire. If private schools lose students to the state sector, the cost of integrating them could eclipse projected gains. And meanwhile, critics of Reeves' policies, including the IFS, question whether the middle class feels the benefit of increased spending or simply the pain of funding it. The middle class squeeze doesn't stop with education. Reeves' proposed inheritance tax reforms, particularly on farmers, on family farms worth over £1 million, have sparked further protests. Generational farmers argue again that these changes threaten livelihoods and cultural heritage, likening the policy to a tax grab. And again, it's imposed with a knee-jerk immediacy. Labour has framed these taxes as tools to address inequality and invest in public services. The Educational Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, argues that they'll break the link between background and success. Yet to critics, the rhetoric veers into populism, pitting private sector parents against state school users and framing aspiration as indulgence. Conservatives and Liberal Dems counter this strategy and say that it punishes ambition. It also punishes those parents and those children who cannot access decent state education because the state schools in their catchment area are underperforming. And no amount of involvement in PT organisations is going to sort that out in the time frame of a child's education. Andrew Griffith warns of a January of discontent, accusing Labour of orchestrating the largest transfer of wealth from aspirational families to the state. And public sentiment matters. A recent poll found that half of Britons believe 2025 will be worse than 2024, and this pessimism may reflect fears that Labour's tax policies are more punitive than productive, aimed more at optics than outcomes. There's also, I gather, a new tax being introduced on plane travel, which will make holidays more expensive. Rachel Reeves' tax strategy is bold, but its reception will hinge on execution. If state schools see transformative improvements, her gamble may pay off. But if services stagnate, the middle class may view these taxes as nothing more than punitive populism. I think the real issue is that we need to reform education, and that isn't being addressed at all. What is being addressed is the pay of teachers and the recruitment of teachers. But if teachers aren't lining up to enter the waiting places, which they're not, I don't quite understand where this recruitment is going to take place. In the end, Reeves' reforms walk a fine line between addressing inequality and alienating aspiration. Whether they tip the scales towards prosperity or a public backlash is something that remains to be seen.